newsroom. Until 2 months ago, Mali was hailed as a shining example of multi-party democracy in West Africa. But after a coup, after Islamist-backed rebels routed the army in the desert north, now comes a fresh slap in the face, this one all too literal. 70-year-old interim president Youkunda Traoré briefly in hospital Monday after protesters roughed him up in his office. They were calling for the leaders of the March 22nd coup to return to power. How civilians got past National Guard security is just one question raised by this incident. Some doubt the army's intention to stay in barracks for good. For the record, Putsch leader Amadou Sanogo has condemned Monday's incident. Unanimous condemnation as well from regional leaders. And on a continent where coups still too often make headlines, the Mali case once again turning into a test of leaders' commitments to democracy. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the deal with Mali, and joining us, French Socialist Senator Richard Yung, just back from a campaign trip, I should say, to West Africa. We have legislative elections in this country, speaking to the French broad, who you represent in the French Senate. Also with us, Gregory Mann, who teaches at Columbia University in New York, and who contributes to the Africa is a Country blog. Thank you for being with us. Amnesty International's Gaëtan Moutou, also back from Mali and Niger, for you guys have issued a report which denounces a lot of atrocities over the past 2 months, and even further back. Maybe we'll touch on that in a moment. And joining us from the State University of New York, SUNY Cortland campus, Kassim Kone, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate, the France 24 debate, where you can always weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our handle at François F24. Before we go to our before we go to the main thrust of what's happened, we're still trying to piece together exactly what happened in that office. Now, I guess I'll start with you, Gregory Mann, because we've heard conflicting versions of what happened on Monday. There were protests called for by politicians who want the return of the junta, and everybody's asking, how did these people make it past security?
Well, it seems clear that the security had to let them pass. The thing to understand is that the presidential palace is actually some distance from the place in which the convention was being held. It's up a long hill, it's up a narrow road, it's quite isolated from the town of Bamako, the city of Bamako itself. So in order for protesters to reach Koulouba, where the presidential palace is, and to actually assault Traoré, they had to be given the green light at some point by the security forces.
And there's even one reporter who said that he saw soldiers waving the protesters through. So what does this all mean?
Well, I think Sanogo, it seems to me, is attempting to demonstrate how important he remains in Malian politics. That, in fact, it's he who holds the cards as long as he holds the power in terms of being able to assure security.
Gaëtan Moutou, you were in Mali writing your report at a time when the mediation was being hammered out here, when this deal that's went into effect today formally was being hammered out. Did you have a feeling that it was all very brittle?
When I was there, I left Mali on the 1st of May. When I was there, everything was kind of settled by the ECOWAS and the military, and at that time the president was appointed, and I think the prime minister wasn't appointed yet when I left Mali, but I could see that there was a sense that the civilian president, it was kind of difficult for him to get to terms with the new power, because it looked like when I was there that the military was still holding power. For example, when I was there were a few politicians, including the former Prime Minister Sidibé, who were arrested, and we asked to meet with them in the military barracks, but we were not allowed access to meet with them. So you could just see kind of who was holding power at that time.
All right, so the question of who holds the real power still very much in flux. Let me ask you, Kassim Kone, what's your reaction to what happened, the interim president having to be sent to hospital?
Well, I was really ashamed of what happened for several reasons. This is the president of a country. That is number one. Number two, this is a 70-year-old man. In Mali, we don't beat up the elderly. This is completely un-Malian. I am very ashamed of what happened.
Completely un-Malian. How do you explain it?
Well, I think that though I support Sheikh Modibo Jara as the prime minister, and both he and Sanogo should bear some responsibility, in what has happened, because they are in charge of the situation. It doesn't matter whether they were behind it, anybody was behind it or not. At least the prime minister and Sanogo should bear some responsibility, because Sanogo, right now is in charge of at least, a sizable part of the military, and the prime minister has full power. And at this point of time, I think they should have prevented anything like this from happening, especially knowing that this was known, there was already wind of something like this happening the day before. And as Greg Mann mentioned, the place where the conference, the meeting was taking place is so far from Kuluba, unless you are flying in a helicopter, it will take you at least 20, 30, or 40 minutes, to get to Kuluba from the place where the meeting was taking place. And so the military is not that far. Kati, military people leaving Kati to go to Kuluba would get there before people, especially civilians on motorcycles, in cars, some walking, from the conference, the meeting place. There is no way this thing could not have been prevented. Because whenever there are marches, or when there were marches, whenever there was a movement, a slight movement, since the coup d'etat, the military's presence, is made known very quickly. So by the time hundreds of people were moving from the meeting place,
so they could, the army could have stepped in at any time and prevented it.
Or they could have, somebody could have done this, and I think the military could have done it.
Richard Young, do you share Kassim Kone's feeling that he suspects malice? Do you suspect malice?
Well, obviously, we find it difficult to understand, because on one hand, Sanogo and the military junta and others have condemned this attack of the president, Traoré.
Prime Minister Diarra, who we just mentioned as well, has condemned it
very firmly. But on the other hand, as it has been said, I have no particular information, of course, on physically what happened, but obviously there is something curious. And the problem is that all this is hiding the real problem, which is the division of the country in two between the north and the south. And whilst we're talking of all these elements, the real problems up in the Sahara are not being coped.
Gaëtan Montou, this is happening in a context where there is a civil war going on, where Mali is effectively cut in two. We can even show you the map on this. With the country cut in two at this point, obviously the role of the military is doubly important. And I know that the deal that's been hammered out does not put clearly the military under the orders of the interim president.
Yes, I would say it's just, in fact, the country is cut into two, but however, 2/3 of the Malian territory are being occupied by the armed opposition groups, and really, I mean, it doesn't put the civilian government and also the Malian army in a comfortable position, yes.
It doesn't put it in a comfortable position. So what's going on when there's the infighting that we've just been describing in Bamako? What's going on in the rest of the country?
In the rest of the country, further north, what we have been able to do when we were in Bamako, because it was practically difficult for us to have access to the northern territory because security was not kind of granted there. So we were able to work mainly with the internally displaced people, and also we were able to work also in Niger with the refugee population. And we had pieces of testimonies on how a kind of a new rule was kind of being imposed in the northern territory. For example, women had been raped. We had reliable pieces of information on violence against women, including rape. And even during this weekend, I was still working on Mali over the phone with human rights defenders from the northern territory. And they told me that before, rapes was being kind of conducted in the military barracks. Now the armed forces, the armed opposition group, will break into the houses of people, and some women had been raped recently. And so what is particularly worrying is that before the arrival of the armed opposition groups, you had the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, who was kind of imposing its new rule in some parts of the territory. And in fact, it has paved the way for some members of the armed group to really be present in the Northern Territory.
I want your reaction, Gregory Mann, because I said at the outset that up until 2 months ago, it was exactly 2 months ago today, there was this coup. Mali had been this example of a poor country, but nonetheless, multi-party rule ever since the early 90s. This breakdown of law and order, it didn't happen just yesterday. What happened? How did we get to this stage?
Well, that's a very long story. The breakdown of law and order in the north is also an old story, right? It's been a story of smuggling, rebellion, smuggling of people, smuggling of drugs, rebellion, free circulation of terrorist groups, safe haven for hostage takers under ATT's government over the last decade. Some of those problems go back even further.
It's hard to police the Sahara Desert.
It's very hard to police the Sahara Desert, especially for a poor country like Mali, as you say, especially without the close cooperation of Algeria, Mauritania, Niger, other neighbors. The question of sexual violence in the north, I think, is a very important one. I just wanted to ask Mr. Mutu about who exactly among these armed groups are committing these acts of violence, because the way that the statements were phrased was actually in the kind of a passive voice. From reading your report, I understood it to be the Tuareg separatist nationalists, the MNLA, as well as followers of Iyad Ghali's Ansar Din, the Salafist movement, and potentially others. But in your comments just now, you've mentioned ACME. So I just wondered if you could clarify that a little bit for us.
Yes, I'm more than happy to give more details. The difficulty we had in kind of really working on this issue of violence against women, including rape, was kind of for the victims to really identify the perpetrators of these acts. But from the information we were able to receive, we could just say there was, we would say people from belonging to the MNLA who were really behind these rapes. But add to that, there were also other armed elements of the group who were behind this. But I mentioned the question of violence against women. I would also add something regarding the situation of child soldiers, because we had been receiving kind of consistent, reliable pieces of information about the use of child soldiers.
In the north or also around the capital?
In the north, mainly by people, by the different groups occupying the Northern Territory.
All right, so the breakdown of the rule of law, as you describe it, in the north, very alarming. What happened on Monday in Bamako, in light of that, is obviously a different kettle of fish. Nonetheless, let's look at some of the international reactions. The regional body, ECOWAS, even evoking this Tuesday the idea of sanctions.
It's incomprehensible that the interim president could have been attacked openly and publicly in front of Mali's defense forces when there is a Minister of Defense and a Minister of Security. This attack was unacceptable, and it's condemned by ECOWAS.
Now, the French ambassador to the UN on a visit to neighboring Ivory Coast going even further.
The diplomatic efforts conducted by ECOWAS with a lot of courage, perseverance and determination. These efforts to find a diplomatic solution based on the departure of the junta, these efforts now, I don't want to say that they failed, but anyway, they've been put into considerable danger by the latest developments. It might be necessary to consider other options.
The necessary to consider other avenues. Richard Young, are we going to see what we saw in Ivory Coast? Intervention with foreign troops, with UN forces, even the French helped out in Ivory Coast. Are we going to see something like that happen in Mali?
No, not.
How do you interpret what Ambassador Aho just said?
What I interpret here is that maybe there will now be a resolution pushed through the Security Council, and perhaps even more on the military point of view. I'm pretty sure that the French do not intend to intervene militarily, except if it is just to help another force, another military force, like the one of the UCAA, the CEDEAO, we say in French? ECOWAS, sorry. Or a force under UN supervision. But I don't think the French intend to do more. First, because it would not be the right message to Africa for the first moves of President Hollande. And secondly, we have 6 hostages in the north, and we are still trying to get them free and negotiate. So the French will stay out of it. But I think we will see now movement towards the Security Council.
Kassim Kone, we have to go to a break very shortly, but just Nigeria most notably says they have peacekeepers on standby ready to come in. Do you think they're going to be called in?
No, I don't think it's going to be called in because of there is a popular movement against the coming of foreign soldiers in general. But at some point, though, I think this might be necessary, but that will depend on whatever decisions the Prime Minister and the President will take. But Mali is turning into a place that I don't recognize personally, where I was born.
You talk about a popular movement against foreign peacekeepers. We'll pick up on that point when we return. This is the France 24 debate.